it's a bit of a mixed picture. I think from the moment that the pandemic, there was the outbreak, a number of us, myself included, felt that it would pull the world in two opposite directions. On the one hand, naturally one would think when there's a pandemic which crosses boundaries that it would be an impetus for countries to come together, to work together, both to coordinate their approaches, to share information, to share any therapeutics, treatments, and to share the vaccine, and also to spread whatever economic hardships there were. And in many ways, the pandemic is the symbol, par excellence of why you can't try to fight transnational threats alone. Whether the US, Spain, Italy tries to fight it, if others are not fighting it, either they're going to stay with their borders shut forever, or they're going to have to help and have a coordinated approach. So that was one trend. The other trend, which again is one that has been pulling at the international order now for some time, was the opposite one, which is this is proof that we need to protect ourselves from the outside. This is proof that we need to be self-sufficient when it comes to food chains and supply chains of masks and PPE and other things. And therefore and it's also the fear of the other, because the virus came from Wuhan or from China, and therefore we need to protect ourselves. And that is added to that is we all face our economic problems, and so we have to take care of our own country rather than take care of developing countries which may face needs. And so between the more self-centered, populist, let's sort of build walls, and the other, no, let's break walls, was a big divide. And I think that divide existed before COVID, and COVID was only a further sort of put more of a lens on those two trends which are tearing up the international system. So you ask me 8 months, 9 months later, I think we still are somewhere in between. The elections in the United States, which just took place, give further oxygen to the more multilateral vision. But, the fight isn't over. I think we have seen an acceleration of old trends. But again, the countervailing trend is the one that I spoke about greater emphasis on multilateralism, greater emphasis on cooperation, the kind of issues that, and we'll come to this, I'm sure, that a President Biden is going to emphasize. But so far, it's been more of an acceleration of that divide, as I said, between two visions of the world order, one which is more focused on multilateralism, on partnership, and the other that is more focused on shutting down borders, protecting oneself from the outside, putting sovereignty and in its most absolutist sense as the highest value to be protected. So I think we're seeing a intensification of the trends that a number of us have identified now, going back to Brexit and to President Trump's election, which are these rise of a more self-absorbed or self-centered, nationalistic, sometimes xenophobic view of the world. But I really don't want to leave the impression that that's the view that's prevailed. It's a tug of war that COVID has intensified but has not resolved. As you say, this pre-existed COVID. I think rising tensions between China and the US, but also Russia and the US to some degree. So the great power competition had been already well entrained prior to the outbreak of the pandemic. The pandemic has both exacerbated it, but also given tools for those who want to exacerbate it. I mean, the whole President Trump's theme about the Wuhan virus, the China virus, that is very much, in line with, but also an intensifier of that competition between China and the US, which, again, whether President Biden was going to be elected as he was or President Trump reelected, this was going to happen anyway. The competition between China and the US is going to be a growing feature of the international system, no matter what. The virus, the pandemic has made it worse because it has been used, manipulated, perhaps. I mean, I'm not trying to paint a picture that China dealt with the virus perfectly by any means. It made critical mistakes, but the notion of trying to pin the entire blame on China, on saying that China needs to pay back, as President Trump has said, that is further ingrained in the American psyche, at least, the notion of China as being enemy number one. So with President Biden or President-elect Biden now heading to the White House, I think we're going to see a continuation of that competition because it was an inevitable competition. China was rising, and the U.S. was in relative decline. So by definition, they were going to meet somewhere in a competitive on a competitive field. But I think with a President Biden, at least it's going to be a more predictable and more manageable rivalry because the areas in which the tensions will exist will be clear, and the tensions where President Biden and Xi Jinping will try to cooperate will also be clearer. So I think we're going to go back to a more managed form of competition, but it's going to be a competition and perhaps even an intense one nonetheless. In looking at the future of polarization, fragmentation of the international order, one could look at the impact of COVID-19. I think it is making things in some ways worse, but we could even ignore COVID-19 for a minute because this greater polarization of the world order was an inevitable consequence of the rebalancing of power among great powers. The U.S. for some time has been on a path of relative decline. I don't want to exaggerate it, but a relative decline, a superpower that has been exhausted by its interventions in Iraq, Afghanistan, etc., but also a superpower that had overreached, overextended, and also just it's a natural cycle of any superpower to have its moment of maximum power and then relative decline. And at the same time, simultaneously, China is on an ascending phase. It's been an ascending phase for some time. As I said, at some point, those two they will clash. And by clash, I don't mean military, but whether it's economically, diplomatically, politically, two very different ideological systems. So I think that polarization is likely to continue with ups and downs. The fragmentation of the international order is also another feature which is very much a function of the fact that we are now in a transition phase of an order that had been, for better or for worse, dominated by the US and the West, basically from the Second World War until now to a large extent. But that order is being challenged and is going to be replaced by another one. And we're now in that interim phase, which in some ways is the most dangerous because countries, states, non-state actors don't really know what the balance of power is going to be. They can't rely on the predictability or the protection that was afforded to them by certain powers. Countries in the Middle East and elsewhere may wonder, is the US still going to be our main guarantor of security, our main protector for the years to come? Do we need to start hedging our bets? Do we need to try to take action to protect ourselves, even if it means aggressive action? And I think you're seeing already in Africa, in the Middle East, in other parts of in Asia, middle powers, both trying to protect themselves from the vacuum that they sense because of this rearrangement of the geopolitical order, but also so protecting themselves and taking advantage of that relative vacuum at a time when they know that superpowers are distracted by other issues, that they have their own domestic issues, and the issue of competition among themselves. So it is a period, and a crisis group, our work is to look at the risks of conflict, try to prevent them and resolve them. And what's been clear to us now for some years is that you're seeing greater, as I put it, either appetite or a feeling of stress on the part of middle powers, again, either to take advantage of what they perceive as this uncertainty, this fluidity in the international order, or to protect themselves from it. And you could look, at what's happening in the Gulf. You could look at what's happening in parts of Africa as part of that renegotiation of relations among superpowers, but also among middle powers at a time of flux between an old order that is on its way out and a new order that is yet to emerge and even yet to have been defined. So to the extent to which the coronavirus is going to affect conflicts and the management of conflict is something that at Crisis Group we've been asking ourselves basically from the first weeks that the outbreak of the pandemic occurred. And, there were some hopes, mainly stemming from the UN Secretary General's call for a COVID-19 international ceasefire. There was some evidence of some groups that felt that now was the time for them to sort of put their weapons aside and focus on trying to address the needs of the populations under their control that were threatened by COVID-19. I think if you look at 8 to 9 months out, what is quite striking is how little so far the pandemic has affected conflict dynamics. There's some caveats, there's some exceptions, but for the most part, the conflicts that we were following in Syria and Libya and Yemen, in Venezuela, in Afghanistan, it's not at all clear that COVID-19 has had a positive or negative impact. Now, it has had a negative impact in some ways, and I think it's hard to deny that. Number one, attention has been distracted because of COVID-19. So there's more effort that leaders around the world are spending, devoting to fighting the pandemic and dealing with the economic consequences of the pandemic within their borders. So that's number one. Number two, it's restricted to some extent the ability of diplomats, media, humanitarian organizations to travel. So it does make it harder to reach and easier to isolate and to hide certain areas from the world's attention. So that is the second factor that one needs to take into account. The third factor is that even if the health consequences of the pandemic so far have not been as disastrous for developing nations as some had expected, we haven't seen the outbreaks in Africa or in Asia or in some places of Latin America, but in many developing countries, we haven't seen the intense outbreak that people feared. So that's partly good news. What we have seen, however, is what I would call the longer term impact of COVID-19, the economic impact because of the shutdowns, because of the drop in economic activity. And that's going to have real consequences in areas that either are in the midst of conflict or on that balance between conflict and no conflict. If you have economic hardships, there's sort of a correlation between that, economic hardships, the inability of the state to provide for its people, to pay for its security services, for example, the divide between the link between that and resumption of aggravation of conflict. So I think we have to be very careful not to be complacent and say, oh, Africa, for example, seems to have been spared the worst of the health crisis, but it could be affected by the worst of the economic crisis. And there you may see in countries like Sudan, like Algeria, like elsewhere, the economic impact translated into conflict and political impact as well. And of course, to the extent that there are health impacts, or that it is isolating certain areas and making it harder for humanitarian organizations to reach, COVID-19 will have inevitable impact on the well-being of refugees, of displaced people, of vulnerable populations, if we see that that their countries are affected by the pandemic, whether it's on the health or on an economic scale. So, number one, I'd say we have to be careful. There could be more instability as a result of the economic impact of COVID-19. And number two, the populations impacted by conflict, vulnerable populations, risk being hurt even more, both by the health and by the economic consequences of the pandemic. What impacts could COVID-19 have in terms of giving a second sort of an impulse to international cooperation? And as I was saying, I think there is at least a good logical argument for why you'll see more cooperation as a result of the pandemic. Why? Because people need to share information, but also share remedies, vaccines, therapeutics. This is by definition, it's a virus that if it is not tackled everywhere, is tackled nowhere. You know, the United States can't shut its borders to the rest of the world forever, but it also can't open them if the pandemic is not tackled in other countries. So there is a real argument, a logical argument, a medical argument, a scientific argument for greater cooperation across the board, including on the economic front, because if countries that are being affected by the economic impact of COVID-19 in Africa and Asia and Latin America, in the Middle East, if they collapse, you could have outbreaks you could have outflows of refugees, you could have state collapse, you could have instability, you could have violence, you could have terrorism, all of which will affect the entirety of the globe. So again, there's an argument for more cooperation on the economic front to prevent those state and societal collapses. Whether that will happen or not, is a political question. It depends on the political calculus of country after country. Are they prepared to go down that road, or do they stick to more populist, more nativist, more inward-looking policies? The result of the election in the U.S. may not have been a full-scale endorsement of President-elect Biden's view, but clearly he won, and he is more of the mindset that, for all kinds of reasons, not just COVID-19 related, but because of climate change and because of proliferation of nuclear weapons and because of the role, the transnational role of social media, he believes strongly, and his team believes strongly, that they need to restitch the multilateral order to try to build more cooperation. So that is a sign, a push in that direction. And there'll be other voices, European voices, the UN, and others that are all going to be pushing in that direction. But let's not underestimate the countervailing force, whether it's now or in a few years, that is going to, particularly if the economic situation doesn't improve, and it's going to be hard to improve given the depth of the crisis that we're facing, the worst economic downturn since the Second World War, some would say, since the Great Depression. Given all that, it's not at all a given that the voices of cooperation, of multilateralism, of solidarity, of international solidarity, will prevail over the contrary view. I think the areas that are open for, ripe for, and require cooperation are boundless. Pandemic is, of course, number one. I mean, the more international cooperation there is, if only in terms of sharing the vaccine once it's available. That's number one. Climate change. I think you'll see, particularly with a new president in the White House, you're going to see much greater impetus for cooperation across the board on trying to tackle climate change. Non-proliferation, whether it's when it comes to Iran, but also when it comes to North Korea, I think you're going to see greater willingness, certainly on the part of the U.S. And the U.S., we have to admit, for the last few years has been the outlier that has not been prepared to cooperate on these issues. I think you're going to see greater cooperation. But then there are other areas where there's at least a need. I don't know what will happen. There's a need for new rules of the road. When it comes to use of new technologies, when it comes to social media, when it comes to artificial intelligence, ideally, you would see the same rules that have been negotiated in the past for chemical weapons, use of chemical weapons, use of nuclear weapons, and others. Ideally, you would see countries come together and try to negotiate rules of the road so that would govern that space. Space, by the way, is another one, but and use of space as a field of warfare, but cyber warfare, social media, artificial intelligence, use of drones, all these issues, it would be, maybe it's being overly optimistic and overly naive perhaps, but it would be a huge area where countries across the globe, if they wanted to come together, agree on rules of the road and make sure that we don't have a race to the bottom when it comes to cyber warfare, when it comes to social media, when it comes to artificial intelligence. I can't say I'm overly hopeful, optimistic, but you ask what are opportunities, where does the need rest? That's where it is. So I think, and some of the president-elect's advisors have said this. Before talking about should we revive the liberal international order, one should ask oneself what it meant. Can it be revived? Should it be revived as it was, or does one need to adapt to new realities and to the fact that I now head an international organization, international crisis group. I must say that when I travel across the world and we speak about not that I do it, but if I were to speak about the international liberal order, I think many would question what that means. Is it really international when it was dominated by some at the expense of others? Was it really liberal when it entailed acquiescence in and complicity in stark violations of democracy and human rights? And was it orderly? I mean, if you lived in Iraq or Afghanistan or Libya or Syria or Vietnam or wherever, or Central America, it wasn't that orderly either. It was very much associated with high levels of violence. So I'm almost in favor of retiring that whole nomenclature of the international liberal order. I think what's needed now is to invent a new form of internationalism, of international solidarity among governments, but also a non-government organization and citizen action towards, as I say, a new form of solidarity. I think that is required, but it does mean renegotiating the balance of power, because the West has had a lot in its own hands, inherited from the Second World War. That balance no longer is the one that exists today, and I think it would be both an illusion, and it would not be a healthy one to assume that we could just rebuild the order that existed before, dominated by the same actors as before, with the same nomenclature as before. I think now is a good time to revisit what does it mean to have a world order. It needs to be more, the benefits of that order need to be more equitably distributed within countries. And that's the whole question about how trade and commerce has benefited some and not others. And I think that's what's given rise to populist movements in the UK, in France, in Italy, in the US. So there needs to be a rethink about how to better distribute the benefits of globalization of this order, but also internationally. I mean, some countries have benefited more than others, and those countries that have not benefited want a louder voice and a larger seat at the table. So I think this is, as I said, we're in a transitional moment. And what's at stake is the negotiation of the rules and the distribution of power and the distribution of resources in that new order that is emerging. I think a core lesson that people have to learn from what's happened across Europe, across the Western Europe, and across the United States, is to rethink wealth distribution. I mean, I come from a country, the United States, where levels of inequality have risen in ways that are really quite astounding. And if coming out of what is now, another depression or recession, the benefits of the recovery are not more equitably spread out, we're going to go into a much darker period yet. And these forces of populism and nativism and xenophobia, which we may condemn, but if we don't try to understand where they're coming from and how all this happened, then we're just going to replicate it and when it comes back, it's going to come back with even greater intensity. So I'm not an economist. I don't have solutions that I could present. I look at it more from a political angle. We look at how conflicts now, I mean, just look at the places where we do work. Let's look at Lebanon. Let's look at what happened what's happening across countries in Africa. Look at what's happening in Latin America. The feelings of resentment towards corruption, towards inequality, towards the unequal distribution of power, resources, and goods. All of that is what's leading to instability and sometimes violence, and one has to take that into account and learn the lessons of the need to tackle this income inequality, this income gap within countries and between nations. And again, I don't have the answer. I could, as a political analyst and with listening to the teams that we have on the ground, we saw it already with the Arab Uprisings in 2011. A lot of it was derived from this feeling that their governments were alien, that they were not representing their needs, that they were not equitably spreading the wealth, that they were corrupt and predatory in their behavior, and that gave rise to all the uprisings that we witnessed in 2011. That hasn't ended. I mean, we saw a second wave in Iraq, in Algeria, in Lebanon, in Sudan. We're seeing things now. We're seeing protest movements in Nigeria. Clearly, if you look at what's happening in Central and Latin America, it's the same theme, all with different variants. So again, the lesson is, I think that has to be heeded, is if you're going to rebuild, and as President-elect Biden likes to say, build back better, the better means more equitably, more inclusively, and more mindful of the downside of globalization, as it's been called, and of the emphasis on free trade, which you could be a free trader, but want it to be fair and want it to be, again, that the benefits and be equitably distributed, and that it not come at the expense of the working class or the middle class. So again, I don't want to say too much because the economics are not the piece that I am most familiar with, but we can see the political consequence of in uneven economic policies and economic policies that are tilted towards the well-off at the expense of the working and middle class. And I think that has to be something that people take into account. And it's true of foreign policy and domestic policy. Both of them have an impact on the well-being of average citizens. I only predict the past. I make a point of never predicting the future. I think the short term to be, if I could put a speculative hat, which is always dangerous, I think the short term is going to be a very treacherous one, because there's a combination of this. What we've been discussing for the last half hour basically is that the old order is dying, and it's dying for a reason, which it wasn't able to satisfy the needs of citizens within nations and of the international community, because too many were left out or felt left out. So there's a real challenge to that order, and that's coming at a time when resources are going to be scarce because of COVID and because of the economic impact of COVID and the recession and the depression that we're currently undergoing. So this is going to be a very difficult phase, I suspect, I predict, and it could be something that is felt across the globe. The medium to longer term is a harder question to answer in some ways. I mean, I like to call myself a pessoptimist, so I am pessimistic and optimistic at the same time. And my pessoptimism tells me that over time, this movement that we're seeing across the globe for greater equality, for less corruption, for more representative government, that holds something that's fresh, that's inspiring. And if it's a message that's heeded, and it could go in very different directions. I mean, the same emotions that give rise to Brexit and to President Trump and to populist leaders around the globe could also be the impetus for a very different form of reaction to an order that is being rejected, one that is more, I would say, more progressive, more internationalist, that puts more emphasis on solidarity between different groups. That also can be the outcome of the same crisis that gives rise to populism and nativism and xenophobia. That fight, the outcome of that fight, is not preordained. It's a matter of political creativity, political courage, and having leaders, political leaders, who can diagnose what the ill is, and then come up with solutions that are consistent with the progressive values that I was talking about earlier.